Hey ladies, would you like to learn how to use fasting correctly to lose weight and improve your health? I know fasting can be confusing for women because of the stage of life that you're in or your cycle, but my guest on this show, Cynthia Thurlow, is an expert on fasting for women. She just released her new book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, and has been featured on ABC, Fox, KTLA, CW, Medium, Entrepreneur, and the Megyn Kelly Show. So this is somebody you definitely want to listen to when it comes to fasting. Stay tuned for an amazing episode. If you're interested in getting thicker, fuller, and stronger hair, make sure to check out fullyvital.com. We've put together a set of 100% natural products to help you get the thicker and fuller hair that you deserve. So check out fullyvital.com. If you're enjoying the show, please make sure to hit the subscribe button down below so you can get notified when we release new episodes. Our goal with this show is to help you slow down and reverse your aging so you can look and feel younger and live your most adventurous life. Let's get right on with the show. Hey, my friend, welcome back to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast. Today, my guest is Cynthia Thurlow, who's a nurse practitioner, CEO, and founder of Everyday Wellness Project, an international speaker with over 9.6 million views for her second TEDx talk, Intermittent Fasting, Transformational Technique. With over 20 years experience in health and wellness, Cynthia is a globally recognized expert in intermittent fasting and nutritional health and has been featured on ABC, Fox, KTLA, CW, Medium, Entrepreneur, and the Megyn Kelly Show. Her new book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, which just released, offers a customizable nutrition guide to feeling your best at every stage of life through hormone balancing, lifting brain fog, weight loss, detoxification, and much more. She has now worked with thousands of women in her private practice to make her unique program of intermittent fasting work for them too. With that said, Cynthia, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks podcast.
Thank you so much. I've been looking forward to connecting with you.
Absolutely. You're like a celebrity on the internet, man. Your TED Talk had almost 10 million views, which is no easy feat, right? It's hard to do. Of course, there's a lot of factors involved, but I want to congratulate you on that first. And I want to just hear your perspective on how that went and where you thought it would go.
Yeah, the decision to do a TED Talk really had a lot to do with being an introvert and wanting to challenge myself. So in June of 2018, I started writing applications for a TEDx talk and started working with a TEDx coach who has now become a trusted and dear friend. In October of 2018, I was offered my first opportunity to speak in Toronto on a very sexy topic of perimenopause. And around the time of my first talk, I was offered a second. And for anyone who's familiar with the way these processes go, you can't talk about the same topic in a second TEDx talk. So I looked at my husband and I said, what do I know a lot about? He was like, oh, intermittent fasting. And it was that easy of a decision. And so I went through 4 or 5 rounds of interviews. And so they selected me. And in March of 2019, I was slotted to do my second talk. Just prior to that, I spent 13 days in the hospital. And the irony is during the hospitalization, when I wasn't sick, I was reminding myself I wanted to get home to my kids. And I felt very compelled to do this second talk. And had I not done a talk in December, I probably would not have been capable of wrapping my head around the degree of preparation I need to be able to do to pull that off. So with a ruptured appendix, I went off to do that talk in Greenville, South Carolina.
Wow.
And I was so grateful. They let me be one of the first several people that spoke. I got to enjoy the rest of the day with my children and some of my family members. And then I didn't think anything of it. I was like, check the box. I did that. I got up there. I think it was 2 weeks later, I got my appendix out. I was recovering at home. And then in May of 2019, it was evident that things were going to be very different with this talk. It had almost 100,000 views the first day, over 1 million the first week, and it just tipped over 11 million views. Wow. So it's really, it just goes to show you that it's good information that people have been looking for. And I sit in complete gratitude and utter shock because that wasn't what was expected. I did that talk to show my kids I was okay. And really just to give women strategies to be able to navigate middle age with grace, because for a lot of women, many women that might be listening or watching this, they feel, that they feel like they lost a lot of hope in being able to feel good. And I think intermittent fasting is one of those strategies that can be helpful for both genders, of course, but uniquely for women when they're north of 35 or 40.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that's a demographic we want to talk about in this book. Now, before we get in, Cynthia, you've obviously been a nurse practitioner as well, and you've seen patients firsthand for a long time. And now you've kind of switched careers a little bit in helping women transform their bodies and their lives with fasting and other healthy ways of living. And so give us a bit of your background and what you've seen in change in the health and wellness space in terms of people's health over the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So I started as an ER nurse in inner city Baltimore. I'm a little bit of an adrenaline junkie, and it was an easy transition into cardiology as an NP. Again, I just mentioned I love sick patients. I like complex problems, and it was like a puzzle every day, fixing or figuring out what was going on with my patients. But over the course of 16 years as an NP, I was getting increasingly disillusioned with the traditional allopathic model. My patients weren't getting healthier. My patients, we were stabilizing symptoms with medication. We were not providing a lot of guidance in terms of lifestyle medicine because, unfortunately, the traditional allopathic model is very focused on time. So you had only so much time to spend with your patients. And in that time, you had to make sure they weren't exhibiting any symptoms that were going to knock them off the planet. You had to make sure that their quality of life was decent. Can they breathe? Can they sleep? Can they pee? Really big things. And, for me, it was frustrating because I felt there were things we were missing, meaning if I could have spent more time talking about the quality of their sleep, if I could have spent more time talking about anti-inflammatory nutrition, if I could talk to them about exercise, stress management, that would have improved everything else, because it really does all start with nutrition. And, my peers kind of humored me by allowing me to have opportunities to talk to patients about those things. But as a rule, there wasn't a widget in traditional medicine to allow me to function that way. And I got to a point after 16 years of watching people, rampant metabolic disease, escalating rates of obesity, more hypertension, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, that I just couldn't write another prescription. And I woke up one day without a business plan. I don't recommend this. I looked at my husband and I said, I'm done. And he was like, what? And I said, I am done. I had no business plan. I literally went to work. This is February of 2016, went to work, told my boss and my entire team that I was resigning. They did everything they could to keep me. And I just said, I'm no longer intellectually growing, which was the truth. It wasn't anything they were doing wrong. And so in April of 2016, I left clinical medicine and started my entrepreneurial journey. And almost instantaneously, I started attracting women that were at the same stage of life I was in, that were fed up and frustrated. They were tired of people telling them weight gain is the normal function of aging, that you just have to get used to not sleeping well, that who cares if you have hot flashes. I interviewed someone on my podcast who said it best, Dr. Avram Bluming, who's an oncologist. He said, men would never tolerate what women have been expected to tolerate for the last 100 years. And I really agree with that if I had not been a clinician, maybe I might not have been able to find some of the answers for my own healing journey, but also my own patients. So within a year, I had a very vibrant private practice, really focusing on nutrition and lifestyle management, which made me much happier. I was like, there are no emergencies anymore in my life. And so from there, it turned into creating group programs and one-on-one programs. And then 2018 was the advent of the TED Talk. And then 2019, things just kind of exploded. All of a sudden, I started creating a program in response to the interest in me teaching people or coaching people through intermittent fasting as a strategy that then, led to my podcast really, increasing in listeners. And then that led to an introduction for a book. And then I wrote a book. And to me, it's really been an amazing last 3 years, for which I'm profoundly grateful. But, when you look back retrospectively, it all makes sense. But at the time, I didn't really know that all these things I was doing and changing were really designed to put me where I am today. And so now I'm in this amazing position where I get to connect with people like yourself. I get to educate others about strategies that are sustainable, because that's really what it's about. I don't want to tell someone to do something that's not something they can do for more than a couple of weeks or a month. I want them to be able to harness strategies they can use throughout their lifetime to improve their quality of life, because that's really what it's about. If you sleep well, you eat good food, you move your body, you eat a little less often, you manage your stress, you're going to be able to navigate whatever decade of life you're in a whole lot more easily and readily. And then the other piece is a lot of what I feel like my platform has become is really speaking to metabolic flexibility, really speaking to educating people. Like, these are the biomarkers you need to look at. Like, objectively, like, I can tell you what they are, but you need to know what these numbers are. You need to know your blood pressure. You need to know your fasting insulin. You need to know your triglycerides. so that you can decide, like, do I really need to change what I'm doing, or am I headed in the right direction? And so a lot of what I focus in is empowering and inspiring people to lead their best life. I know that for a lot of men, they may not work with me directly, but I always say that if I rub off on their significant other, their wife, their mom, their sister, it will inadvertently also rub off on them. And, when we look at the statistics, we look at a study that was done pre-pandemic in 2018, this UNC Chapel Hill School of Public Health study, that 88.2% of Americans were metabolically unhealthy. And that was pre-pandemic. That number has to be in the 90s now. So those of us that are outliers, like you and I, we want that to be the norm. We don't want to be outliers. I genuinely want people to be healthy and to be able to live a high quality of life, because there's nothing worse. Like, I will give you an example. You can imagine in cardiology, I saw people that were 85 years old that had vibrant lives. I saw people that were 55 years old that lived like they were 105. And to me, quality of life is everything. And people may not readily know that now, but you start to see as you get older, there's huge differences in the way that people are living their lives. And, you don't want to be in a position where you can't enjoy spending time with your loved ones, or sleeping well, or being able to climb a hill with your kid or your grandchild. There's just a lot about our current kind of modern day lifestyles that are impacting our ability to live a healthful life.
Agreed. And I'm glad you're doing this very important work, Cynthia. As you were speaking, I was thinking of this picture I'd seen. I think it was the 1960s or 70s, picture of an intersection with lots of people crossing, and they were all skinny. All of them were skinny. There was not one fat person, or I should say obese person. And then on the other hand, I think there was a picture from 2020 or 2019 of an intersection, and you could just tell the stark difference between how we've been becoming metabolically inflexible and gaining weight and having insulin resistance and all those problems, type 2 diabetes, that come with hand in hand with this lifestyle. And so I believe I pulled these statistics from your TED Talk. You said that 2/3 of women in the 40 to 50 year range are overweight and half are obese. And to me, it's a one-way street, meaning things just keep getting worse every year that you're alive. And so is that the same statistic? Has that changed? And let me ask your perspective on why things are so bad, or getting much worse even.
Well, I think the statistics post-pandemic, things are probably worse, to be honest with you. I think on a lot of levels, there are like we use the term multifactorial. There are a lot of different reasons why we're seeing more metabolic disease, why we're seeing more issues, especially in women. We are, as a byproduct, we have less lean muscle mass, we have more body fat. That's our physiology. That's because even if we choose not to procreate, we are designed to create and grow life. And so I always remind women that we are not mini men. We have menstrual cycles for a reason. But if we're looking at the etiology for why people are less metabolically healthy, I think about, we eat too frequently, we eat too little protein, we eat too many of the wrong types of fats, things like seed oils, which are complete rancid garbage, inflammatory oils. We eat too many carbohydrates. And I'm not talking about non-starchy vegetables. I'm talking about the processed stuff, the bread, the pasta, the rice, etc. On a lot of levels, we don't manage our stress. Our bodies are so overwhelmed, and we say yes to everything. So we're sympathetic dominant. Our autonomic nervous system is so slanted towards the fight or flight mechanism that we're cranking out cortisol like we're being chased by a rabid animal, when in essence, we're just dealing with life. And our body can't differentiate between traffic stress and being chased by a rabid animal. I think about just the endocrine disruptive chemicals that we are exposed to in our environment, our personal care products, and our food. And that just kind of adds up. And on top of that, the amount of people that are, they're in a position where they're very sedentary. I think it's 25% of us, don't move. I mean, we literally sit for more than 8 hours a day. And that statistic is probably higher than that. So we don't move. We eat too frequently. Our sleep is certainly impacted. We're exposed to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. You think about just the byproduct of, these over-harried lives where we're never relaxing, we're over-exercising. A lot of people, it goes extremes. Like, people either don't exercise and they're a couch potato, or they over-exercise. And I see examples of this all the time, that people never have rest days. They're in CrossFit 5 days a week, or it's related to gut health. There's a lot of things that can go on in the gut microbiome that can contribute to rampant obesity. And then just looking at hormones, like as a huge kind of umbrella, looking at hormones, whether it's sex hormones or cortisol or insulin, We have so many imbalances that are contributing to this problem. We have women that are going into perimenopause, and I used to say 5 to 10 years. Now I would say it's probably 10 to 15 years prior to menopause. So 35 and up, you're really impacted by this. And these very subtle changes that are happening in a woman's body can impact their sleep, their anxiety, their mood, just with the loss of progesterone. When you get this relative estrogen dominance, which is really just speaking about this relative over amount of excess estrogen in the body in response to lowered amounts of progesterone, they start dealing with hot flashes. They can have weight gain. I mean, no woman wants weight gain, breast tenderness, et cetera. And so I think on a lot of levels, there's a lot of different things that all start happening. It's almost like a bucket. The bucket gets filled up a little bit, and then it just overflows. And unfortunately, a traditional allopathic medical model provider is going to look at things a little differently than myself and a lot of my colleagues. And so I think it's very, very important to understand that it's not just one thing, it's all the things. And until you are dealing with all of the things, it can be challenging. And weight loss resistance is a huge problem. And obviously also is metabolic flexibility. But I find a lot of providers, I mean, there's a lot of very thoughtful providers that are out there. I don't in any way want to be critical of my peers, because they're doing some amazing work. And goodness knows the last 2 years, healthcare professionals have been bearing the brunt of a lot of what's going on with the pandemic. But I think it's also important to say, like, we need to look beyond our training. We need to think beyond how I was trained 25 years ago versus now, and how important it is to continue to question dogma, to not be rigid, to not be dogmatic. Because if I had been in that old mindset, I would still be stuck in that mindset where I was not flexible. I was not applying new principles. I was not thinking outside the box. And so I think it's really to the betterment of our patient population and our clients as well, that we're constantly challenging the status quo. I mean, I attended a university that encouraged us as nurses to challenge everything, because more often than not, nurses are on the front line with their patients. They're their patient's advocate. You don't just do an order just because. You have to be able to understand why you're being given an order or given direction. And I apply that to nearly any field, that I think all of us need to be questioning things, because the current dogma is not working. The current philosophies are not working for any of us, for most of us. And we need to kind of turn the ship around, if you will. We really do need to work together to find ways that we can help improve the health and longevity of our population. Otherwise, like, I think about my children's generation and my grandchildren's generation are definitely going to be impacted. And that makes me very sad. So I'm very vested in the future, making sure my children, all of our children, future generations, have a high quality of life, because the current statistics cannot continue in that direction. Not only can our healthcare system can't sustain it, but we're not going to leave anything for future generations.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great answer. You listed many areas that we are deficient in, lacking in, or bringing items into our body that just don't belong there and are changing our endocrine systems and whatnot. And to somebody that's listening, it might be like, oh my God, there's so much to do. But it's actually not that complicated. If you take one item at a time, for example, something you talked about, Cynthia, is beauty and bath products. They have endocrine disruptors in them. Well, you could take one day, learn what are the clean beauty and bath products, clean out everything in your cosmetics, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, and from your bathtub, and then get new products that are completely clean. And you've almost solved that entire problem in just a day or two. So it's not as complicated as some people might think. And of course, there's multiple areas. We'll have to go down in each of those areas. And Cynthia's got some resources to help you in that. And I want to talk to you specifically about fasting and fasting for women and weight loss. But before we get in, there's a couple of concepts I think let's get out of the way. We've discussed a couple of times. One of the things is insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. And for people like you mentioned that are eating processed carbs, that are eating a lot of those, these go into your body, they get digested pretty quickly, get into your blood. Now there's a lot of glucose in your blood. So your pancreas releases a lot of insulin to try to push this glucose out of your blood and into your cells, which need it to make energy. All that's good until you keep eating these big, heavy meals. And after a while, your cells just get resistant to the insulin trying to push glucose in. So this results in more blood or more glucose in the bloodstream, which results in more insulin being created by your body. And Over time, this causes insulin resistance where the glucose can't even get into your cells. And this leads to type 2 diabetes and a lot of complications from there on. And also, not to mention from an anti-aging and longevity standpoint, more glucose in your blood is going to attack the proteins, the DNA, and the fats. And your skin is made up of a protein called collagen. And so you're going to age faster too. So if we can reduce blood sugar in our blood, it's just helpful along the way for a long, long time. But I think, Cynthia, we've also talked about two other things, which is metabolic flexibility and metabolic impairment, which I'd like for you to describe both of those terms to the audience and what they mean.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to, if there's an analogy to make insulin resistance clearer, I always say it's like knocking on the door and no one can hear you. That insulin receptor is trying to do its job, but it is so worn out, it can't work effectively. So when we talk about metabolic flexibility, I'm really speaking about things that can allow our bodies to be able to utilize both fats and carbohydrates as a fuel substrate. Big fancy way of saying flexibility. We want to be able to use both fats and carbohydrates. Most Americans are really stuck using carbohydrates because they're incredibly metabolically inflexible, meaning their bodies can't effectively move back and forth. If you want to think about it this way, my dad used to always overfill the gas tank. Most Americans are overfilling their proverbial gas tank because instead of allowing their body or allowing the gas to use all the gas in the gas tank, get all the way down, that's when you can tap into fat. Most people are constantly topping off their stomach. They're not even hungry, but they're just eating in response to, oh, it's 12 o'clock, I got to eat lunch. Oh, it's 6 o'clock, I got to eat dinner. Instead of allowing their body the opportunity to utilize all the fuel that they have left in their body. And Jason Fung does a really beautiful job with this analogy of the refrigerator. All the carbohydrates are in the refrigerator. You have to use up all the carbohydrates before you can get to the freezer, which is where the fat is. And so we don't do a very good job allowing patients to understand that you have to restructure your meals to become more metabolically flexible. What does that mean? Focused on protein first. Protein is the most satiating macronutrient, then adding in healthy fats. Although here's the caveat. If you're eating ribeye, you already got healthy fats. You don't need to add more fats. Or if you're having a piece of salmon, you don't need to add more fats. But if you're having, let's say, a lean piece of chicken, or you're having a piece of cod, you can have some avocado, some nuts, whatever. And then utilizing carbohydrates as, non-starchy carbohydrates, lots of vegetables. And then deciding for yourself, depending on your metabolic flexibility, where you're, if you're weight loss resistant, you may need to lower your threshold of carbohydrate intake even greater. And so that's a really important distinction. When it comes to biological markers of metabolic flexibility, the things I look at are high blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is greater than 130/85, it's a sign you are becoming insulin resistant. If your triglycerides, now I like triglycerides under 100, ideally closer to 50. But if you look at most of the guidelines, it's usually between 100 and 150. I can't tell you how many cardiology patients had triglycerides in the 300 or 400s. And I'd say to them, this is a carbohydrate problem. They're like, what? I don't understand. And making it very, very clear that your body produces triglycerides in response to this overconsumption of carbohydrates. Next is HDL. So this is considered to be the quote unquote heart healthy cholesterol. Yes, it's important. If you are a female, you want that number greater than 55. If you're a male, greater than 45. Very, very important. I would also add in there that people like to focus on LDL, but that's a whole separate kind of subcategory. Looking at fasting glucose, you want this between 75 and 90. That's ideal. But I would challenge you on top of that to know what your fasting insulin levels are. This is oftentimes the very first biomarker that will dysregulate way before hemoglobin A1C, way before fasting glucose. You want it between 2 and 5. I cannot tell you how many women come to me and we do that lab and their fasting insulin's 20. I'm like, well, guess what? Until we can get your insulin levels lower, we can't tap into fat stores. You're not going to free up those fat stores and that release that weight unless we can get that better managed. And then, lastly, we think about waist circumference. And this is something people can do at home. You don't even have to go to the doctor's office or your healthcare provider's office. For a man, we want your waist circumference under 45. I mean, that's pretty good size. For a woman, we want it under 35 inches. But if you have more than three of those parameters, you have metabolic syndrome. You are going to be prone to metabolic inflexibility, insulin resistance, probably leptin resistance, and you are going to struggle to lose weight. So I think all of those metrics are really important, but metabolic flexibility is really just speaking to the ability for your body to be able to flex between using different types of fuel when your body needs to. If you're running a marathon, you're going to use a different type of fuel substrate than if you're doing a sprint. But understanding that most of us are stuck in this kind of, they call it carbohydrate burning mode, where we get hangry before meals. We struggle with weight loss. We struggle with energy dips. We get sleepy after eating meals, versus being fat adapted when we can go 4, 5, 6 hours in between meals. We don't struggle to lose weight. We have consistent levels of energy. And unfortunately, in this modern day lifestyle, I always say 3 to 4 o'clock is the witching hour, when people are, feeling like right now, as you and I are recording, when they feel like they have to run and go get a coffee or a candy bar or something sugary, it can sometimes be a sign that your body is not properly fuel regulated. And that is something you can certainly work on.
Yeah, it's such a great answer. Thank you for sharing those markers and the definition of metabolic inflexibility. I know that I've done the ketogenic diet multiple times in my life, and every time I do it, my hunger just disappeared. It was gone. I would eat at noon, and then at 8 p.m., I would go, am I hungry? I'm not even hungry. I can go to bed. No big deal. And so just that freedom and understanding that you don't have to eat every 3 to 4 hours, it just freed me so much just a few years ago. So I'm so thankful that I did it. Now I do eat low glycemic carbs, about 100, maybe 150 grams on most days. But again, these are not packaged carbohydrates that you find like in breads or pasta or white rice. These are just either veggies or fruit sometimes. And so I'm very careful about adding carbohydrates and keeping that very low, because from an anti-aging and longevity standpoint, not only are the diseases we're talking about with metabolic inflexibility going to catch you sooner or later, but also you age faster. And so that's a double whammy there. So, okay. And I'm glad that fasting is really catching on, because first of all, it's how we were in nature and it's free. We're not paying a pharmaceutical company all this money to be hooked for life, or some other corporation to be hooked for life. Is just how we were in nature. And so that's what makes me really happy. And so for the people that Cynthia might say to you that, okay, fasting doesn't work for me, or it doesn't work at all, what might be a quick rebuttal or some benefits that you actually have to tell people all the time?
Yeah, so I agree with you. Fasting is not new or novel. It dates back to biblical times. Now, there are some people that fasting is not appropriate for, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about that. But when someone says fasting doesn't work for me, I always want to learn more. Like, tell me more about your experience. Were you dirty fasting? Were you consuming, there are fit pros out there. God bless them. I'm sure they have good intentions. But if you're eating during your fasting window, you're breaking your fast. If it's under 50 calories, it doesn't count. You can put collagen in your coffee, add up half a stick of butter. And I remind people that's not clean fasting. I advocate for a clean fast, because that's generally when people will get the best results. And so what that talks about is consuming things like bitter coffee, well, bitter without anything in it, bitter teas, black tea, green tea, because there are polyphenols in those plant-based compounds that will help boost fat oxidation. They're going to potentiate the fast. They're going to suppress hunger. Lots of water and unflavored electrolytes are great. So clean fasting, when people have been dirty fasting, sometimes people just don't know how to eat around their feeding window. We have something called the amygdala in our brains. It's our reptile brain. And if it perceives that there's no food coming and it panics, it's our lizard brain, it'll override the prefrontal cortex. And before you know it, someone has scavenged up every bit of food. They're all of a sudden they'll say, I just binged. And I say, okay, well, we have to reflect on, did you overfast? Were you not fasting for your menstrual cycle? Did you overeat because you ate the wrong foods to break your fast with? So let me give you an example. If you break your fast with protein and healthy fats, or protein and carbs, notice the key is protein with either option. You're going to feel a whole lot better than if you sit down and eat half a watermelon and a bag of cookies and a thing of soda. And I would never advocate that anyone just eat carbohydrates by themselves. Carbs aren't bad, but there are carbohydrates that are less healthy for you. And so whether you have a steak and some broccoli, or you sit down and have bacon and eggs, or you sit down and have a cup of bone broth, those are going to be better options. You're going to make better decisions. So that's another thing that I see. Not fasting for your menstrual cycle. So if a woman is still 35, under 35 and under, you're still at your peak fertile years. I'm so protective of women's fertility. If you're a thin woman under the age of 35, there's no reason for you to be fasting every day. Like, absolutely no reason. There are times in our menstrual cycle when we should fast. There are times when we should not. If you're fasting when you should not be fasting, that can explain why you're struggling. And this might be why someone's having increasing sleep disturbances, or they're hungry all the time, or they're struggling with weight loss resistance. Now, if someone's obese and they're in their peak fertile years, they may benefit from some degree of time restricted eating during their schedule. Now, perimenopause, so 35 and up, 35 to 50, perimenopause, special time. This is when we're getting fluctuating amounts of particular sex hormones. So we've got a lowered amount of progesterone coming from the ovaries, which puts a little bit of a strain on our adrenal glands to make a little more progesterone. We are more sensitive to stress. We are more sensitive to food choices. We are more sensitive to certain types of exercise. We are more sensitive to a lack of sleep. And so if you are, I'm sure that your listeners are very familiar with the concept of hormesis. And I always say the right amount of stress in the right amount at the right time. So if you add in a little bit of intermittent fasting targeted for, your follicular phase and your menstrual cycle, and your sleep's dialed in, and you eat an anti-inflammatory diet, and you're not over exercising, and your stress is managed, fasting may work very well for you. On the other hand, there are a lot of women that overdo it. They do CrossFit 5 or 6 days a week. They're exhausted. They sleep terribly. They're grabbing, McDonald's 3 days a week. They're eating crappy foods the rest of the time. Their stress is out of control. Guess what? Adding in intermittent fasting is going to do them no benefits whatsoever. And in fact, I tell women, if I cannot get you to sleep through the night, I can't get you to lose weight, do not add in fasting. And then there's this beautiful time. The average age of menopause in the United States is 51. So we'll say 50 and up. Most of those women, once they've gone through menopause, which is 12 months without a menstrual cycle, they can fast really effectively, provided that they're sleeping, they're eating the anti-inflammatory nutrition, they're dealing with their stress, they're not over exercising. And that is when men and women, menopausal women and men, can oftentimes fast the same way. They can fast, continuously. They can fast every day. And so I think that's really the beautiful distinction, is allowing people to understand that I'm not saying men and women are the same. I'm telling you that postmenopausal women who are not dealing with hormonal fluxes day to day, week to week throughout a menstrual cycle, and men generally have an easier time, provided that those lifestyle pieces are definitely dialed in. So those are usually the three key areas where I see people, they'll say, oh, it didn't work for me. And then when they start telling me more, I'm like, okay, well, I can kind of see why. Your macros weren't put together properly, you weren't clean fasting, and you weren't fasting for your menstrual cycle. And those things can make a huge difference.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's double click into the fasting for menstrual cycle, because that's a question I've had. It was one of the first questions I put in when I was researching what to ask you. And so let's talk about reproductive years. I believe you said under 35. And so the first, the 28-day cycle, there's the follicular phase, and then there's the luteal phase, and then there's the actual menstruation. And so there's estrogen that's high in the beginning, and then the progesterone gets higher at the end. How should women kind of think about how to fast, how many hours to fast, and just how should they approach this life cycle or lifetime in their fasting journey?
Yeah. So from the day you start menstruation up until right before ovulation. So for argument's sake, we're going to say this is a perfect 28-day cycle, just to make it easier. So on day 1, you start bleeding. Day 14, you ovulate. Up until ovulation, you are estrogen. That's the estrogen dominant phase of your menstrual cycle. This is the follicular phase. This is when you can push the envelope on your exercise. You can fast longer. You can go low carb or ketogenic. It's an amazing time. I always say estrogen is our superpower. Then you have, this ovulatory cycle. Then you get fluctuating amounts of testosterone, progesterone, estrogen. And then the luteal phase is a different phase. Obviously, progesterone predominates. This is when you can't push the workouts. You have to eat differently. You can't fast as long. And I always say the 5 to 7 days preceding when your menstrual cycle starts, I don't actually advocate for women to fast. They can do a 12 to 13 hour digestive rest. That's great. Actually, everyone in the world could benefit from eating in a 12-hour feeding window. But for those women in particular, we know that you need about 100 more calories, discretionary calories from a high quality source. This is when I'll say, have a little bit of sweet potato, have some squash, have a little bit of berries. This is not the time to go pig out on pasta and like pizza and candy. That's not what I'm talking about. And then once you start menstruating, then you can start back to a fasting schedule. And I find that when women really align with that methodology, they do a whole lot better. Their cravings go down, they sleep better. I think it's when we condition ourselves to like push through it. Like women kind of think if a little bit of fasting is good, then more fasting is better. If a little bit of low carb is good, then lower carb is better. And so we have to kind of reframe our thoughts around this. But if you honor your physiology, you will do much better with fasting. And I think really understanding that when estrogen is predominant in that follicular phase, that's going to give you an advantage. And then understanding after ovulation that you need to back down on that fasting window, change the way you're eating, change your exercise. Maybe you need to rest more, and that's okay.
And so in the first 14 days, when estrogen's a bit higher, you said women can fast more, they can push their bodies more, they can exercise more. And so when we speak about fasting in that context, Cynthia, are we talking 14, 16, 18-hour fasts? Like, what do you mean when you say that?
Well, and so let's argue and say that someone's fat adapted, meaning they've been doing this for a while. We know their body is able to flex between different fuel substrates. They could do 16 hours, they could do 18 hours, they could do 20 hours. Maybe they want to do 1 24-hour fast during their follicular phase. And I'm an advocate once someone is fat adapted, whether you're male or female, that you vary your fast. So you're not doing just a 16-8, 30 days out of the month. Like I really do encourage women, just like we don't do the same exercise every day. We don't eat the same foods every day. Our body thrives on variety. And that's a really important distinction because I see a lot of people that will say, I've been doing the same thing for 6 years. And I'm like, well, how are your results? Oh, they're terrible. So our body likes variety. Our body needs variety. If you notice in the gym, if you do the same exact exercises with strength training, guess what happens? At one point, you're going to start to plateau. You're not going to see that change. Your body needs, that hormesis. You have to kind of challenge your body. I mean, even for as long as I've been fasting, which has been a long time now, I will consistently push, some days I go 20 hours, maybe the next day I go 15, understanding that you can lean into what your body's cues are and understanding that in that follicular phase, if you are a female, that you can push that envelope a little bit versus, in the luteal phase, you may be 12 or 13 hours. Maybe you're doing 14 hours. It's not going to be those really long fasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. I typically do an 18-6 most days, but I think on Sundays or Saturday, I'll typically eat an earlier breakfast and kind of change things up.
Yep.
And just getting a perspective on how women should approach fasting in different phases of their life, and even within a certain phase when it's reproductive years, is so insightful. And I'm sure women can learn more when they come to the services that you offer and your courses. But this is a great primer for women to understand how to kind of think about these things and how to get the rest of the lifestyle in place, including sleep, which is so important. And that ties into the next question I had, which is the circadian aspects of your biology and whether we should be skipping breakfast, eating late dinners, or eating early dinners, and eating during the light part of the day, so to speak. I understand that there are some Eastern practices, holistic practices, that talked about eating very light dinners and eating during the daylight windows. And I've kind of shifted my schedule. So I eat, first time I'll eat it probably is noon. And then the second time I'll eat probably is at 6 p.m. And that's before the sun goes down, especially in these summer months. And so I would love to hear your thoughts, Cynthia, on how we can align circadian rhythms with the fasting periods and how that looks like practically for women.
I love this question. I'm completely nerding out on chronobiology right now. And if you look at the research, we actually do better eating earlier in the day, that it's very much aligned with insulin sensitivity. And that could look like maybe someone breaks their fast at 9 or 10 o'clock. And I know that sounds very early, but they're also closing their feeding window by 3 or 4 o'clock. And so I encourage people to really experiment. And once you start to understand that our physiology really starts to change after 40, that we become increasingly more insulin resistant, even if you're doing all the right things, understanding that you may do better if you're going to have a carbohydrate load, having it midday as opposed to end of the day, eating aligned with when it's light outside and not eating when it's dark outside. We have these peripheral clocks. So it's not just our brain taking in information through our eyes, through our retinas. We know that we have melatonin clocks in our gut. And I remind people all the time that these melatonin clocks are so sensitive that if you eat a big bolus of food an hour before going to bed, guess what? The melatonin clocks are like, time out, increased cortisol. We're not going to bed. We got to digest all this food. And that, for any of us that wear Oura rings, your Oura ring is like screaming at you the next day saying, your heart rate didn't come down. Yeah, exactly. Your readiness scores in the toilet. So I think it's important from like a very high level philosophy to understand that as that aligns and kind of oversees what we're thinking about in terms of women. So what that may look like is during your follicular phase, you're more insulin sensitive. So you can probably eat a little later in the day. In the luteal phase, because it's a byproduct of progesterone, you tend to be a little more insulin resistant. This is a time you have to really think about thoughtfully. When are you closing your feeding window? When are you starting your feeding window? What are you eating, macros wise with your meals? And understanding that, just by byproduct of the normal physiology, you may need to adjust your carbohydrate intake. I would definitely encourage women in the luteal phase to consume that carbohydrate load earlier in the day when we know we are much more insulin sensitive. And for anyone that's listening and saying, I don't understand what this means, it's really understanding that as our bodies take in cues throughout the day. So we get up in the morning, hopefully we're getting sunlight on our retinas that helps suppress melatonin. It increases cortisol, tells our body it's time to get the day started. And really, we should be thinking about sleep when we wake up in the morning. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it's with the understanding that everything you do in the morning is setting you up for sleep success later in the day. And then on top of that, really understanding that we want to put ourselves in a position where we eat when it's light outside. We don't eat within 3 to 4 hours before bedtime. No, I'm not talking about special events, being on vacation. I'm just saying in a normal day-to-day existence, when you're at home, you have some control over your schedule. That is much more aligned with chronobiology. And I think the whole suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain is fascinating. Like the more I learn, the more humbled I am by how all these intricacies in the brain are communicating with the body and hormonally. And, melatonin is thought of as the sleep hormone. And I tell people it is this master antioxidant. We make less of it after 40. I've been experimenting in conjunction with my integrative medicine provider to do some high dose melatonin. It's been life changing. So for anyone that's listening, that's like, wow, this is really cool. There's so much good emerging research in this area. And what that has forced me to do is to really think thoughtfully about when I break my fast, when I end my fast and my feeding window, and what I'm choosing to eat throughout the day so that it's more aligned to support, good glucose stabilization, good insulin sensitivity. One little tip that's so easy for people to do. In fact, my husband and I used to make fun of these people when we were younger. Now we are these people. But after you eat a meal, go for a 10 or 15-minute walk. You really have to think about muscles as glucose reservoirs, and that your muscles, like insulin resistance, actually starts in your muscles. So you want to keep your body moving. Like after a meal, it's going to help with insulin sensitivity. It's going to bring your blood sugar back down. So going for even a 10 or 15-minute walk, I mean, that's so easy, right? And that's actually a hack. And so I remind people, like, take that 10 or 15-minute walk after your meal, connect with your significant other, walk your dogs, get your kids on their bikes. I mean, don't make it a big deal. It's something that we've grown to really love. It's very much a part of what we do almost every day. And I would encourage listeners, like, it's such an easy way to support metabolic health.
I love that. I typically do take a 15-minute walk after lunch, and I'll, take my shirt off outside to get some sun while I'm doing it, and walk barefoot on the grass to get some grounding in. So you get 2 or 3 different, things you can do, biohacks, if you will, in one go. Now, from what I'm understanding, Cynthia, to make it oversimplified, you're saying in the reproductive years, in the luteal phase, be careful. In perimenopause, be careful. But post-menopause, do whatever you want. And in the follicular phase, do whatever you want. Your body can handle it. And of course, there's lots of caveats to that. But that was what I was thinking for a second, is you can be a little bit, your body is more forgiving in those areas. Okay. All right. So let's get on to the next question, which is, what typical, and we're coming up on time, so I'll be quick here, but what typical challenges do you see people with fasting? Like, what mistakes are they making that are just common across the board?
I think a lot of it starts with the macros. So people are still not eating enough protein. And to give you an idea, I say everyone needs to work towards 100 grams of protein a day, period. For a lot of different reasons. After the age of 40, it's not a question of if, but when. There's a process called sarcopenia, which is muscle loss with aging. And you want to think about it, like if insulin resistance starts in our muscles, guess what? The less muscle mass you have, the less calories you will burn, the less insulin sensitive you will be. And the way to counteract that is strength training and eating adequate amount of protein and getting high quality sleep. So the macros piece is always a huge issue. inadequate protein. People are still eating inflammatory seed oils. And I just did a presentation at A4M. And one of the things I talked about is that if those inflammatory seed oils are heated and reheated, they're going to create even more oxidative stress and inflammation. So they're best to be avoided. In Austin, where you live, I've come to find there's a lot of restaurants that are very progressive, that are using alternative options beyond vegetable oils, which is fantastic. And then the carbohydrate thing, like people are just overeating carbs. They're not eating the right types of carbs. I'm not anti-carb, but the more weight you have to lose, the more conscientious you need to be about your macros. Next, like people just not focusing in, like they sleep 3 or 4 hours a night and they wonder why they can't lose weight. Well, guess what? Adding in fasting is like adding gasoline to a fire. It's not going to help you. So that's another common thing that I see. I would say the other thing is people get like rigidly dogmatic, meaning they're not willing to get out of their own way. They're like, if a little bit of fasting is good, then more fasting is better. Like I can't tell you how many times I'm asked to moderate in a group where they're doing a 48 or 72 or 96-hour fast. And I'm like, you are a hot mess and you should not be doing that really long fast. So just because something is good doesn't mean more is better. So it's wrapping your head around the time. Like there's a time and a place to do longer fasts. If you're already thin and lean, you should not be doing crazy long fasts. That's my feeling. It's the law of diminishing returns. And Ted Naiman talks about this as well. So I feel comfortable. I'm like, if Ted Naiman is in agreement with that, I feel very aligned. I would say probably the last thing is people thinking fasting is going to be the fix all for everything. Like if your gut's a disaster, if your hormones are terribly imbalanced, if you're not sleeping, if you're over exercising, your macros are a disaster, you've got other prevailing things, your toxic burden in your body is really high. Fasting is not going to be the panacea for everything. It can certainly be a really healthy strategy, but if you're thinking that's going to fix every single problem, it can help, but it may not fix. Like you may require more effort. Like I see a lot of women on social media as an example, they're weight loss resistant and they desperately want fasting to be the thing that is going to fix it all. And I always say you need to work with a talented coach, nutritionist, healthcare professional, maybe all of the above, to find out why your body is so stuck at a set point, because it could very well be you've got a gut infection. Maybe you've got, a heavy metal issue. Maybe your thyroid's in the toilet. Very likely, you've got a sex hormone imbalance. And if your testosterone's low and your estrogen's high, guess what? You're going to struggle. You're really going to struggle. So I think it requires a comprehensive approach. And so those are some of the common things I see, or the common themes I will see, where women really want to force. And I understand they're frustrated. They want an answer. But our bodies are so much more complicated than that. Sometimes it can be subtle nuances. I mean, one of the reasons why I gave up dairy in my 40s was that it was like the last piece of the puzzle. I'd taken everything else out, and losing dairy was 5 pounds I could not get rid of. And I said, gosh, I didn't eat it that often. Mm-hmm. But some foods, as we become older, no longer serve us. And so certainly in my situation, dairy was, I call it affectionately, the 5 pound dairy, but understanding you may need to make some changes beyond what you're already doing to see the results you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's fantastic. And Cynthia touches on lots of things in her book, including balancing your hormones for metabolic health and wellness. And I know that's a complicated topic, Cynthia, but if you could give me a 30-second, 60-second answer on the overarching approach to balancing hormones without getting into the details, how would you say you do it?
Well, I would say first and foremost, you definitely need to be sleeping, because we know that if you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night, you're going to have a tougher time balancing leptin and ghrelin. You'll have a more challenging time balancing your blood sugar, which will then lead to poor dietary choices, because in those circumstances, you are not going to crave broccoli. You're going to crave highly processed, hyperpalatable foods. I think the other piece is that when you are eating less frequently and your body is becoming more fuel efficient, we talked about carbs and fats, that you're not going to have cravings, that you are going to be satiated between your meals, that you are going to have more energy, which is going to translate into more movement, more enjoyment in your life. And so on every level, the eating less often philosophy translates oftentimes into better sleep, better balanced overall hormones, more satiety, more energy, which will then contribute to the desire to be more physically active. And so obviously this is a broad overgeneralization, but that's typically how I kind of think about how fasting can be so beneficial.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic, Cynthia. Thank you so much. And of course, you can read all about it in her new book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, that just launched a couple of months ago. Cynthia, where can people find you? Your Instagram, website, give us everything.
Yeah, thank you. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. I have a wonderful podcast called Everyday Wellness. I'm also now the co-host of the Intermittent Fasting podcast with Melanie Avalon, where you can ask us all sorts of questions about fasting and metabolic health. I am very active on Instagram. I have a free Facebook group on Facebook. Obviously, it's Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. And I'm also on Twitter, but be rest assured, I'm a little snarky. So you may see another side of my personality. I tend to, there it's the kind of the manosphere. You can get away with a whole lot more, but you can see a totally different side of my personality there as well.
It's not the hangry side of your personality.
No. I can be snarky.
Okay, got it. And how do you spell Thurlow?
Thurlow. It's THURLOW.
Okay, I'm so glad you're partnering up with my friend Melanie Avalon. You guys are going to create magic together, and folks should definitely tune in and listen to you. So with that said, Cynthia, thank you so much for coming on the Anti-Aging Hacks Show. I really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me.